Let's go beyond the connection. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. Today we have on a very special guest, Tom Dewar. Now, I think, Tom, what's special is a lot about your background, but I would like to say that you are a pioneer in technology, in information architecture and structure. And today you are the Chief Information Officer at Acupath Laboratories. And what I would love to do before I turn over to you to explain a little bit more on your background, what we're going to talk about today is why data and information strategy for today's cloud-based applications, why it's so important, why the infrastructure and the data behind it and the network that it runs on is so important. But before we do that, what I'd love to do is I'd like to say that not only are you a pioneer, but I just learned that your background, you owned a computer when nobody owned computers, before Bill Gates probably even had the goal that he stated, the computer on every desktop or in every home. And that wasn't a reality when you started. But all the way through that, you bring an interesting start. You were a social worker, you were a caseworker, a child welfare caseworker, and you actually got your technology start in that industry. But I'm going to let you explain a bit more about that because you do such a better job with that story. And then we're going to dive right into today's topic.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you. Yeah, I started out as a caseworker in child welfare, and quickly they understood that I had some computer skills because I had a computer before that, not quite before Windows. I was around the same time that the Apple II came out, was when I had mine. So they started to ask me to do computer things, and I ended up getting this position where I was in charge of statistics for the entire office as one of the many things that I did. And so I looked at the process, and it was a very antiquated process where they had people taking things and they would handwrite them and they would type them and then give it to somebody else who would do calculations and then handwrite them and type them and go along. And they had just gotten computers. So I said, look, I said, why don't we do this on a computer instead? And they said that they weren't really going to be able to get people to use the computers because they were new and it wasn't part of their job description. So they weren't going to be required to use it. They were union employees and it wasn't something they were required to do. So I said, look, I said, if I can get them to do it, would you let them do it? And they said, sure. They said, but it's not going to work. So I said, all right. So I went and I spoke to them. I got them all in a room and I said, look, I said, if I could get you, I said, how many of you want to be in this job in 5 years? And none of them raised their hand. I said, you want to do something better than this? You want to get something more exciting? I said, if you go on this journey with me, I'll be able to have you put WordPerfect and Lotus on your resume, and you'll be able to use that to get a better job. I said, would you want to do that? And they all said, yeah, they were very excited. So I said, all right, so go on this journey with me and let's do this. And so what I did is I changed it so that instead of typing everything onto a typewriter, they would type it into their computer. So a person would write it up, they'd type it in the computer, save it on a floppy disk, and then hand it to me. And then I took it and I had this Lotus macro language programming thing that I did where it would pull everything in and it would create this report. And so the very first time I created the report, I gave it to my boss. He handed it out at the meeting that they usually had. They had a weekly meeting. So I handed them the statistics to look at. And he left and he came back 3 hours later and he said to me, he says, this darn meeting, it was all your fault that it was this long. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, normally the meetings are only an hour, but today's meeting was 3 hours. And I said, oh, what happened? So he said, so you put all these graphs and charts on the report that were never there before. They used to be just numbers. He said, nobody really understood the numbers before, but now with all the graphs and the charts, they were looking at them and they started to ask questions. How come you got more cases than I got? How come you closed your cases faster than we did? So they started to ask all these questions behind the numbers. And it ended up being this really long, exciting conversation. He said it was really good. We were happy about it. But he said, made the meeting take a lot longer than we were used to. He said, on the other hand, he says, you are now stuck. You better make sure you do this report the same way every time because people want this information the way it is. They think it's much better. So the other interesting thing is, so I ended up leaving there and I went to Leak and Watts, which is a large behavioral health organization. And I was their chief information officer for 14 years. And while I was there, I get this phone call. It was about 10 years after my time at the city when I had made this report. And somebody called and he said, hey, is it Tom Dewar there? And I said, yeah. And he says, is this you? I said, yeah. I said, how can I help you? He says, will you create some kind of a statistical report when you were working for the city? And I said, yeah, why? And he said, oh, I'm very confused. He said, we just developed this new report that we want to try and implement and we want everybody to come out with. And it's a new statistical reporting system. And we're trying to give it to them and they keep complaining that they don't need it because they have their own and they want to keep using what they've got. And he said, and it's this really strange thing that seems like it's 10 years old and I have no idea what they're talking about. And I was completely astounded. I said, I can't believe that 10 years later they were still using this thing. And when you talk about sustainability, I said, I couldn't possibly have imagined that this would have outlasted me by that long, but it actually did. And I was really impressed by it. But we did convince them and they started using the new system and they were happy with it.
I think what that goes and that travels towards is that you had a vision that you brought everybody along. As a CIO, you have to have a vision of where the company is going, the business is going, the technology is going, the data infrastructure architecture is going, the impact of AI. You have all these different things that you're putting together into one plan. And one of the things that you talked to me about on our last call was that all of that planning, one of the biggest things that you worry about is the succession challenge that haunts every CIO because you put a plan into place, but then what happens after you leave? 10 years after you left, they were still using your technology. Tell us a little bit about how today's CIO needs to be thinking about the succession plan and what that means.
Sure. Yeah. Unfortunately, that situation spoiled me in terms of sustainability because it's certainly not that easy most of the time. So I try and think about that in terms of any place that I go. I want to make sure that I leave it better off than I came. And I want to make sure that the changes that I make last long after I do. You don't want one of those situations where things are people oriented, where when that person leaves, all of a sudden something falls apart. So I try and make things in such a way that they're going to sustain themselves in the same way that I created that program so that it was very easy to use and that anybody could have picked it up and just continued using it. I try and do the same thing. I try and find equipment that, will take care of itself whenever possible. I try and put in systems in place that will continue to work after I leave. I try and make sure that other people know how to use them and that they're simple. One of the things I had done with the statistical program is I had to ask questions. How many cases are in unit 833? How many cases are in unit 777? So this was very simple. Anybody could pick it up and use it if they didn't know what they were doing. So I try very hard to do that kind of thing. The reality is that many times when you leave, people change things. One of the things that's important is standards. If you standardize hardware, that makes it a lot easier to maintain because if you start having this chaotic structure of all kinds of stuff, it's very difficult to maintain. And I've had places where they've standardized while I was there, and then the minute I left, they decided it was a free-for-all, and they'd get all kinds of stuff, and then things would fall apart, and they couldn't figure out why. So unfortunately, you can't control what happens after you leave, but you can control what happens before you do, and you try your best to try and make sure you put things in place that will sustain and will continue to keep the place going and continue to do the great work that you did while you were there.
When you're putting this plan into place, it's call it herding cats, call it managing chaos. This is a mission critical environment. Downtime is not an option, although we know what happens, but everybody's relying on the network. Everybody's relying on the data today, not only just for doing our jobs, but our clients are relying on access to the data and the experiences that we're creating for them. So how do you manage? How do you put this into place, this plan into place in a mission critical environment like that?
Like you said, it's chaos. So you want to try and manage the chaos as much as you possibly can. As IT people have to embrace change. We have to make sure that we understand change and we change things as we can. But you want to try and make sure that while you're doing that, you keep the ground underneath you solid enough to keep things running. You have to change things in planned ways and make sure that you do things in such a way that you don't reduce downtime, that you make sure that you are careful to not make changes that are going to be more chaotic than possible. You want to try and make sure you work with users and try and prepare them as much as possible for change. They tend to be resistant to change, but you want to make sure that you get them to ready to understand what it is that's going to happen and to really try and be as comfortable with it as they possibly can be, knowing that they're resistant to change, but you at least want to try and get them as comfortable as you can and to be prepared for what's going to happen. And then, like I said, make sure that the changes that you make are changes that are not going to impact all at once. You don't want to do anything that's going to blow the ground out from under you. You want to make sure that, you're building as you're going so that this way you're making those changes in small enough increments that it's not disruptive.
And being the CIO, you never have a lack of requests for changes. The list goes on, but you got a macro perspective that you got to hold. You also talked about how you prioritize, and you're in the healthcare. And so healthcare applications, not only mission critical, these can be critical for diagnosis that has impact on somebody's life. We're talking about technology and data and access at the highest levels here. How do you go about prioritizing the applications that you're supporting over the network and how that you build on those and you build that plan?
So I try and make sure that I look at what is critical. I've worked in a lot of different types of healthcare organizations. I've worked in a 3 hospital merger. I've worked in urgent care. And when these applications are mission critical, if they life support sometimes is important in a hospital environment. Yeah, if something goes down, people could die. So you want to make sure that you try and do your utmost to make sure that those things are working. One of the things I had to do in hospitals, we had to rebuild the ICU so that we took the old one and we built it a new one to make sure that we had enough room for people for during COVID and to make sure that people weren't sitting in lobbies because it was so overcrowded. And so you wanted to make sure you built that out in such a way that everything was working, everything was tested before you went live. You wanted to make sure that all the other mission critical applications were doing what they needed to do and do as much testing as you can to make sure that, everything is safe and able to work the way you need it to be. And you also have to make sure that the stuff that was there before is working as well. So it's this interesting dance of trying to make sure that you keep the old stuff working while you get the new stuff working and then transition them over in a planned way that you're not going to have any downtime or any problems.
So one of the things that we had discussed before, and I'm going to venture into the area of AI. Everybody wants to talk about AI today, but you want to talk about the foundation you have to build before you layer on AI and working with your data. And I'd love to have your perspective on what you meant by that, like that data foundational layer.
Sure. Yeah. I've been CIO now for almost 3 years at Acupath. And so we're an anatomical pathology laboratory. And so we do testing. And one of the things we're doing with AI right now is we've started what's called digital pathology, where we take our slides and we digitize them. And we've now working with a company that allows us to put a AI layer on top of them for a specific test that we do called Euro 17. And that allows the pathologist to get this AI layer to look at those slides and look at what could be a possible area of interest. So this is a urine cancer. It's a bladder cancer test that uses urine. So it looks at those cells and it says, hey, these could possibly be of interest. The pathologist looks at them and they either add or remove cells as they go along. And that allows them to make the AI algorithm smarter because as they add or remove cells, it learns from them and it makes it better. And this makes for a faster and more accurate diagnosis. And so this isn't one of those big AI applications that you're throwing AI at everything. It's a very specific application for a very specific reason, but it could be very life changing. Certainly, if you're the patient, this is going to mean the world to you that you've got a faster and more accurate diagnosis. I try and look at it that way. That I try and when I look at AI, I try and look at it in specific applications. What can I use it for that will make the most sense? And getting back to your question, for the last 3 years that I've been at Acupath, one of the things I've been doing is looking at their data. We have two 20-year-old databases of homegrown applications. And so the data is all over the place and it's not very structured, made for what those applications were for. And as things were piled on over the last 20 years, this got tacked on, that got tacked on. So one of the things that I've been able to do is to really start to understand the data. And so one of the things that I started to do is I started to build these Power BI reports for people, and that really helped me to sort of understand the data and where it was. Because before I go letting AI loose on something and trying to figure out how it's going to do an analysis, I need to know what's the structure of the data. Where is it? Where does it live? Why is this data important? If I pull this information, what am I going to get out of it? And how does this data connect to that data? Like I said, they're two big databases. They connect in certain ways. So I need to know, how does this one connect to that one? If I make a connection between this and that, are the actual real connection, or did I break something and I'm making a fake connection? So the more I understand about that data and the data structure, and the more I understand about how to pull things out, the more I could start in the back of my mind thinking, okay, wait a minute. Now, if I think about how AI works and what I could do with AI, how can I pull this together and manage to pull it into and have AI really do something meaningful with it that I actually know will work? As another example of that testing, we've had reports our systems have had for years that people know are bulletproof reports. When you run that report, you get this data and you know it's correct because people have checked it manually for years. So I'll replicate those reports in Power BI and I'll make sure I get the same results. Because if I get the same exact results in Power BI, then I know I've actually done it. I've gotten my queries right. I pulled the right information from the right table. And so looking at that kind of data that way will help me to better understand as I start to think, okay, what can we add AI to? How can we do this? How can we do an analysis that's going to be meaningful and useful and real and actually accurate data? Because, of course, getting back to the fact that this is healthcare data, people could live or die if this data is wrong. So you want to make sure you get it right.
As you're talking here, I had this picture of you as a data detective because you had to go in there and you had to sleuth. You had to find the data, you had to find where it's fragmented, you had to connect it, you had to understand what's valuable, what isn't, what's the business use cases, where can AI add value. And then you discovered something that you talked about before is that the clients don't always know what data they need. And there's hidden value in the data. And that's what, especially huge, vast sums of data that you had over 20 years. Not everybody has that 20-year database that it can train AI models on and provide tremendous value. Tell me a little bit about how you feel about like the hidden value of data and the role of you as this chief information officer, basically translating what we have, what we can do. Now I'm going to go make it happen.
Sure. Yeah. So a few things. And one is in that detective work, sometimes I would develop things not necessarily because somebody needed them. I would develop them just for that detective work so that I'd get to learn stuff. And so I would create reports just for the sake of learning how the data was structured. And then all of a sudden I would think to myself, hey, this person could use that or this person could use that. So as I showed them to people, then they would be like, oh, yeah, that's really cool. I didn't know I could do that. And then they would ask me, that report's great, but if you could just add this or if you could just add that. So that was one way to go at it, was to just show them what was possible and have them look at it. The other thing is, I find it really crucial anywhere that you are that if you're going to be a CIO, you need to understand the business. You need to understand the work. You need to understand what people do. So I do a lot of software development for those in-house software that we have. And so in order to do that development, I've taken on all the testing myself, where I do all the in-house testing to make sure as a first level that this is going to work the way it's supposed to. So in order to do that, I have to really do the work as those people do the work. And so that's really helped me because I understand many of the functions of the lab. Recently, I've had to learn a whole bunch of stuff about what pathologists do because I had to put together this application. It's helped me to really understand how they do what they do, because then I can really look at it and say, okay, now that I know what they do and how they do it, I can think about if I was that person, what would I need? And it also goes back to my background. Like I said, I started out my career in child welfare. I was developing software for caseworkers later on in life. And when I was developing that software was very successful. And one of the reasons is it was successful is because I was looking at it from when I was a caseworker, what would have I needed? And so one of the things I did at the time was I realized that they were in an environment where everything needed to be done yesterday. And so when you're in an environment when everything needs to be done yesterday, how do you really prioritize? How do you know what's most important? And so one of the things I did was I developed a menu system for that software. So that menu was actually a dashboard. And this was a really early dashboard, long before people were really doing dashboarding. And when that worker went in, they were able to actually see their cases, and they were able to see them in such a way that they would know these are the ones that I still need to make visits on, that I'm overdue for a visit. These are the ones that I'm overdue for notes on and things like that. So it would really give them what they need. So I try and keep that mindset in every place that I go. For this particular job, what is it that they need? What would help them? What would make it easier for them to do their job? And as I'm testing this software, it's funny because I'll see stuff that when I ask other people to test it, they say everything works fine. And then when I go to test it, I'm like, how on earth do you live with this? And so I end up putting in tickets myself constantly and saying, hey, we need to fix this because this is no good. I'll go and I'll talk to them and I'll be like, all right, is it just me or does this take you forever and it's a really convoluted mess? And they're like, no, you're right, it is. But I just figured that's the way it was supposed to be. And I'm like, nah, let's fix that. And I'll try and put in tickets to try and make it better. I'm a firm believer in something called poka-yoke, which is mistake proofing. It's used in manufacturing. And the same way that car manufacturers have figured out if you leave your keys in the car, you'll lock your keys in the car. So they figured now you don't ever have to take your keys out of your pocket. And this way you'll never lock them in the car. They know that if you have only one tail light, that you're going to get a ticket. So instead of having two taillights where if one goes out, you get a ticket, they give you like 15 taillights so that you need 14 of them to go before you're going to get a ticket. So they're constantly doing all these things to try and mistake proof the car. It's one of the reasons why they're making self-driving cars now, because they figured out the only way to really protect us from ourselves is to protect us from ourselves. I always look at help desk tickets and IT systems the same way. I try and figure out what is it that people are doing wrong and how can I keep them from doing that in the future.
So much you said there. One of the biggest things that I took away from that was that you have to walk in the shoes of your users. Your point, the pathologists or caseworkers. You have to understand what they're doing, what's important to them, their language. It's actually spending time with these folks. You can't do it remotely. You can't learn like that. You have to get involved and you have to ask questions. You have to ask what's important because then you're going to uncover things and they're not going to know the capabilities of what you can do for them. I remember Steve Jobs, when they first came up with the iPhone, he was like, I could never have gone into a focus group and come up with the idea, take away the keyboard. We don't need the little keyboard anymore. They wouldn't even have known. But we know what we can do. We know what they want to get done, and we can bring that vision together. And so that's what I took out of that.
That's extremely important is to understand what it is that the business is and how they work. And one of the things that's complex about where I am now is there's so many different types of jobs. I have to understand most of them in order to try and figure out how these software systems work because these software systems support every single job that we have in the lab. So I have to understand all the different pieces of it as they do so that this way I can figure out how to do things for, there are some processes people are amazed by because I'll do it from beginning to end where normally 7 people will be doing that, and I'll just do the whole thing straight through because I know the process because I have to in order to make it better.
Absolutely. And so I want to make sure we have time for the area of cloud applications and migration to the cloud because one of the most important things is we have to be able to the more data that we have, the more robustness we have in our networks and our technology, the more we need a cloud infrastructure where at the end point there is a lot happening. And like your clients, they're all over the country. They can be in rural areas, they can be in urban areas, but the technology has to work for them where they are, right? And it has to be, you have to have that in mind. Tell me a little bit just about why a cloud migration for you and your business is important, but if you could extrapolate and why it's important for all of us to be thinking that way.
Sure, yeah. It's funny because one of the things that goes back to is I was CIO at Leakin Watts during September 11th. And when that happened, people that weren't in the building actually lost access to their property just because they were in the neighborhood. So you could be 3 blocks, 4 blocks, 5 blocks away, and you could still lose access to your property and you could lose access to your data center. And so that made me always think having real estate tied to IT is a bad idea. So if there's any kind of a possible way that you can avoid that, there's a better way. And then when I started to work at Lutheran Social Services in New York, when I got there, I rebuilt their entire infrastructure in 2 years and I rebuilt it in a cloud-based way. I tried to think to myself, okay, like knowing what I know now after having been a CIO for 14 years and knowing what's available now, I told the CFO, I said, look, I said, if I have to rebuild this, if I don't build it in such a way that I could run it from my living room, I'm doing it wrong. And what I had no idea was that 3 years later, I actually ended up having to run it from my living room because that's when COVID happened and we all shut down. And the CEO came to me and he said, look, he said, it looks like we're going to have to close. And we have a very comprehensive environment. He said, we have clinics that have to stay open. We have homeless shelters. We have schools that are going to have to teach from home. We've got caseworkers that have got to run out in the field. We've got all kinds of office workers that need to work from home as if they were here. He said, how long is it going to take you to prepare us to be able to work remotely? And I said, about 3 days. And he looked at me like I was nuts. And we actually did get ready in 3 days. And they were so impressed by the way things went a year later that they actually wrote an article about it for their website. They had their PR person interview me and write an article. Because when I first met with the CFO, he asked me for my first week observations of the place. And I said that I gave him my first week observations and he affectionately renamed them the Burn It All and Start Over memo. And so they wrote an article called How a Burn It All and Start Over memo prepared us for COVID because I was able to do that. So I always think that way when I was at the hospital, right? You figure hospitals aren't moving, they're not going anywhere. But we ended up having to move a data center because we had to expand our emergency room. having real estate that you're stuck with was a problem. And then the other thing is, if you're disaster recovery, if there's a disaster, what happens? If that place blows up, God forbid, what's going to happen to that data? So having your data cloud based, first of all, for that reason is really important. But the other thing is, we are long past the time when we could have an army of people to maintain a data center. I figured there's two ways to do things. You could either build an army or you could have stuff that takes care of itself, and nobody's building armies anymore. So in order to have things that take care of itself, nobody wants to be that person that the exchange server goes down in the middle of the night and somebody's calling and waking you up. And if you still need to do that in this day and age, then you're doing something wrong. So really, to have that kind of a cloud-based infrastructure where somebody else, that's their job to take care of it. They maintain hardware, they make sure it's there. You don't have to worry about upgrades. So, you have to go down because there's an upgrade, stuff like that. So for us at Acupath, we have two major applications, as I said, that are homegrown applications. One of them is a client-based application. It's a laboratory information system for our pathologists that work with us. And so it's their EMR pretty much. And they can't afford any downtime. They need this thing to be up all the time. And so to have something that was based in our building, which is what we originally had, we had this Citrix access-based application. It just didn't make any sense anymore. So when I got there, one of the things they tasked me to do was to have this thing rebuilt. So we rebuilt the entire thing as a web-based application in Azure so that this way it's always available, it's always there, and they have the ability to use it in any given point in time.
That goes to I think the last point here that I wanted to ask you about, which is now in a cloud-based world, we're also then more and more reliant on our networks. And our networks aren't just within one building anymore. Our networks are covering this hybrid work environment. Our networks are covering access to all of our clients. Our networks are covering urban, rural locations. So there's a trend these days to make sure that there is redundancy to have a resilient network that not only wired, wireless, connecting to satellites, low orbit, high orbit satellites, having multiple ISP connections and that failover and redundancy in the cloud-based architecture that in the vision that you're talking about. How important is that network redundancy?
Oh, it's extremely important. It's extremely important. One of the things that's nice about having it being cloud-based and being in Azure is that we're able to make sure that the environment is redundant because we bought it that way. And so they can provide it that way. The other thing is it's flexible. You can add processing if you need to. You can add bandwidth if you need to. They make sure they have failover data centers. So all of that stuff is built that way. And so you don't have to worry about it so much. We have our own redundancy because we want to make sure the lab is available. We build redundant systems to make sure that the lab is available. But because that's in the cloud, we can make sure that it has its own special redundancy so it's always available whenever somebody needs it.
So I have just one last question, Tom, for you, and that is we've covered so much territory here. If there was one takeaway that you wanted other CIOs and information technology experts that are watching the podcast today to take away from today's conversation, what would that one thing be?
I guess the idea of really understanding the business and knowing what it is that the people do, because really it's the key thing. I've seen a lot of IT systems fail, and it's because people don't understand the business well enough to know what it is that's needed. If you really understand the business, if you really understand what people do, if you really understand why your customers are who your customers are and why they need you and your business, if you understand what drives your company and what the mission really is about, if you understand those things, it really helps you to build better IT systems. And then the secondary part of it would be to constantly revisit, what you're doing and reassess it and make sure that what you're doing today still works. It may have worked yesterday, but it may not necessarily work again today. You just want to make sure you keep constantly reassessing it to make sure that you're making whatever adjustments are necessary to keep it so that it's just as important as it is today as it was when you first started it.
Yeah, this going back to the idea of understanding your customer, building solutions for them. There's a lot of CIOs, CTOs, CISOs that I talk to, and almost universal is they have a problem having a seat at the executive table because If you don't understand the business, if you don't understand the clientele, the end user, and what they really need, then how can you be a catalyst for growth? You have to have that. That's my overall takeaway from what you said there. Here's what I would love to do. It's people are going to have questions. I have no doubt about that. Would it be appropriate if we gave out a link to your LinkedIn profile that people could reach out to you if they had questions?
Of course, sure, yeah.
Fantastic. Tom, the goal of this podcast is to bring different perspectives, insights, share from our experiences. And if we all do that together, then it's like the rising tide that lifts all boats. And I thought you did an amazing job today being a part of that rising tide. I just wanted to say thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and it's been a great experience, and you made it really simple and easy. Thank you.